So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is James. I'm the current president of the British Veterinary Association, and I'm also somebody who was diagnosed with dyslexia at the end of my first year at university at the Royal Vet College back in 1998, that would have been. So a lot has changed in terms of our understanding of dyslexia since then, and our understanding of how it affects people and how they might manage it in their day-to-day lives. And as we'll come on to discuss in a moment, hopefully some of the diagnosis and the thoughts around that as well. But I suppose that's the reason that I've been asked to be here to help support this webinar today, is that lived experience that I've had throughout my adult life. And I know Rory's going to come on to talk about that as well. Bit of housekeeping though as we begin. The chat box is open. Today is a session for everyone who's here to ask their questions and have those questions tackled and answered in as best a way as we possibly can do. And so really we invite any questions to come into that chat box. I do recognise as well that there may be questions that you would like to ask that you would prefer to ask anonymously, a letter with too many letters in it, a word with too many letters in it. So if you have a look on that chat box where it says to everyone, if you just drop down on that, you'll see somewhere in there, you should see my name towards the top of it as a co-host. And what I would invite you to do, if it's a question that you would like me to ask anonymously or to discuss anonymously, then click that and it will just send the message to me. I also recognised here that we're talking today about a condition which can affect people's ability to read and to write and to get the context of what they would like to across in those mediums. So going to be equally encouraging of people sticking their hand up in the participant list. So if you, I'm sure, familiar with that in Zoom by now, but if you're not, click on the participant list, click over your name, and it should offer you the opportunity to raise your hand, and I'll be keeping a bit of a watch on that as well. Because if you would prefer to unmute and to ask your question or make your comment to Rory and I directly, then we would be absolutely welcoming of that. As I say, for those of you who are just coming in through the waiting room, though, just a reminder that the session is being recorded. So please, feel very free to do that, but recognise that you will be recorded if you do. Okay. I think we've covered most of the housekeeping. We'll see how we get on now over the next bit of this session. And what we'd like to do, please, to just open this is to expand a little bit on some of the comments that I've just made about my lived experience with dyslexia. And I'd like to go right back to being at school. And as I say, this I hope is a different situation for certainly for my children at school now. But I went to high school in Chester in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. And actually, my dad was a teacher at my school. And Dad had a Master's of Education in dyslexia. And throughout my entire high school career, Dad would be saying to my teachers, do you know James is dyslexic? You know James is dyslexic. We should be testing James for dyslexia. Have you thought about testing James for dyslexia? And my teachers at that point came back with the answer, don't be so daft. James is at the top of the class in science and he's doing very well in maths and he's coping okay in English. Dyslexic people are those who sit at the back and generally cause an irritation, and he's not one of those. So go away. And that was the response of the teaching profession at that time. But, as Dad would have predicted, I didn't do as well in my GCSEs as my teachers predicted I would have done. I didn't do as well in my A-levels as my teachers predicted I would have done. Indeed, had to go off and resit those in order to get into vet college. And still, and please don't tell anyone this, I wouldn't give this away on a public webinar. I still haven't got the A-level grades that they were asking for me to get into vet college. But it was really when I got to the end of my first year at university and bombed those exams that I was able to then work with Dad, but also a fantastic personal tutor to whom I feel ever in debt at the Royal Vet College, to work through a diagnosis. And at that point, as I say, sort of 97, 98, was the first person to be diagnosed with dyslexia whilst at college. They'd had a number of people through the college with dyslexia, but the first person to be diagnosed whilst there. So it was a learning curve for college as well at that point, about how they were going to manage me, how they were going to support me. And what they did with me was to take me off to part of the University of London up near Finsbury Park. I remember I had to walk past Arsenal's home ground to get there, which was hard. But I was able to get some support there, some comments from people who were very well versed in the learning techniques and more about the remembering and the regurgitation techniques of the things that I'd learned. And to try and begin to put some of that into practice. But what I've found, unsurprisingly, is by now a kind of 21-year-old person into their second year at university, was that an awful lot of what they were talking about were things that I'd already put in place. And I put them in place just because that's how I recognised I needed to learn and how I needed to perform. And people often say to me, well, what's it like living with dyslexia then? You say, oh, I don't know. I've never tried living without it, you know, so I can tell you what my life is like, but I can't tell you where the dyslexia ends and where my general lack of organisation, inability to ever find the car keys or my wallet, inability to hold a coherent thought for a prolonged period of time, but also my quite random comments that will often come into conversations as well and lead us off in various different directions. I can't tell you how much of that is dyslexia and how much of that is just James, the person. And where do those two end anyway? So there we go. That was where I was up to. But as part of what I wanted to do then as a vet, it was to try and make people realise how we could support the 5 to 10% of our society who are dyslexic, because almost certainly you work with dyslexics, and absolutely definitely some of your clients are dyslexic. So how can we support those people? How can we get things across to them in a way which is accessible to all? And that really, I think, is my key thing that I would like to explore with everyone today, is what can we do which will make things more accessible for everybody? Because I would promise you that there is no reasonable adjustment, or however we phrase it, which could be made to improve a dyslexic person's understanding or processing of something, which would be harmful to non-dyslexics in the same environment. And I think that's something that I would like us to sort of chew through today. I jump forward to today and I think about my youngest daughter who's gone off to school today with her yellow glasses. She's inherited an awful lot from me, and bless her, she's inherited dyslexia as well. And, you know, it's fantastic to see what she does and the quality of the testing to demonstrate that that's helpful to her. Just to put some context around that. So, well, you know, she's got yellow glasses. What difference is that going to make? The opticians were able to demonstrate that her reading rate went from 57 words a minute to over 120 words a minute when you put these glasses on her, and that you could show that yellow was the one that achieved the best result for her. So I think that's absolutely fantastic. And I'm very happy to explore any of those things today. I can see that there's some chat already coming into the chat box. So I'm going to stop speaking for a moment and pass across to Rory, who I know is here both as a vet, as a dyslexic vet, and also as an ambassador for the British Dyslexia Association, or for those of us in the know, the BAD. So I'm going to pass across to Rory and ask him to introduce himself and where he's coming from today. Thank you, Rory.
Thank you, James. And I mean, yeah, I just read through the chat, and what you were saying there is, I mean, I think it's my story. It seems like it's Ruth's, Julie's, that everyone has had very similar experiences. And it's great to see some people on this session that are either dyslexic or possibly think they're dyslexic, or are aware of dyslexia as a whole. But I want to start by just going over dyslexia very, very briefly. I think if you're watching this webinar, you probably are aware of dyslexia already. But dyslexia is actually classed as a blindness. I don't know if you knew that, James, but it is classed as a blindness, and it is all to do with a neurodifference. We don't say a disorder, we say difference nowadays. And it is all about your processing, and quite often affects reading and writing. As James said, his daughter struggles with words per minute. 57 sounds actually quite high for me. I think I'm on about 25. When I was diagnosed, my reading speed was in the bottom 0.1% of the entire country, including children. I'm well aware of that issue, and it is a different thing for everyone. Not all dyslexics have the same type of dyslexia. I first became aware of dyslexia when I was a 16-year-old boy. My mum became aware of it because I had one teacher, and I was 16 back in 2008, and I had got all the way through primary school up to that point as a dyslexic, and no one had ever mentioned it. And one teacher mentioned it to my mum, and suddenly she became obsessed with dyslexia. And she started buying me books, buying her books, stupidly buying me books because I would never read them and I couldn't read them, or at least I'd start them and I'd finish them 3 years later. But she would start reading these books and she became obsessed with it and really trying to understand how my brain worked. Now, I think applying this to the veterinary profession, what a lot of vets who are dyslexic have experienced is actually they've done all right at primary school and secondary school, because vets, as we know, are in the top whatever percent of the IQ of the school intake. And it's very high requirements to get into vet school. So we're often taking the cream of the crop of those students. So what has often happened is the dyslexia has been masked by the IQ of those students. And I saw a couple of people mention in the chat that they got this as they got to A levels that they really started to struggle. I was exactly the same. I sort of didn't really do any work through GCSEs, got through fine, and then A levels, I suddenly turned over in the morning and was like, oh my God, I know nothing and I'm going to flunk these. And luckily enough, I had AS levels to tell me that, and I retook a few things, and I really had to work for the first time properly through my A levels, and I didn't really understand why. I think at this point, when you start to not struggle, but you start to be aware that you're not quite as normal as non-neurodiverse people, I think you become labeled as the thick kid or the slightly slow kid or the disruptive one. Absolutely is something we hear a lot from teachers, or at least heard a lot from teachers when they weren't as understanding about dyslexia. And that is a toxic environment, because you then get pushed into that. Once you're labeled as that in school, you then start to act out, you start to not pay attention, and actually that then worsens. And one of the things the British Dyslexia Association, or BAD, as James points out, is doing and really focusing on is early diagnosis of children at ideally primary school level, so that we can prepare them for secondary school. Now, I then got into vet school, and I was diagnosed when I was in my first year of vet school, just like James, at the RBC. I am going to shout out to Fiona Nuri right now, because Fiona Nuri is, I don't think I'd be here if I didn't have Fiona Nuri. She took a real interest in me. She got me my test, and she helped me work through it and helped me understand, because it's slightly ironic. When you take your dyslexia test, you get given a folder about this big of all the breakdown of your reading speed and your cognitive function and your processing speeds and all that sort of thing, and you have to read it, and that doesn't work. So Fiona sat down with me and she went through it all with me, and yeah, she was amazing. Anyway, so I got diagnosed in first year of uni, and unlike James, I hadn't developed coping strategies. I'd been blindsided by A levels and scraped through with what I needed. And I didn't get the asking grades for RBC, but they very kindly let me in anyway. And because I'd scraped, and because I'd only realized at A level that I was different, I hadn't worked out how my brain worked. It took me 4 years to really understand how my brain worked and to work out exactly how my brain processed things and remembered things in the best way. I failed second year and I failed third year at RBC because I hadn't understood how I revised, and I was just trying to cram, and I was just trying to read lectures, and I was just trying to write them down, and I hadn't thought and really understood how my brain worked. That I was very lucky to get through, and now we have to address the numbers of people coming through vet schools with dyslexia. Now, 10% of the population is dyslexic, and actually I estimate, and there are estimates, that doctors, vets, and other higher entry grade university courses have a higher rate of dyslexia because they are more masked. So with more diagnosis and more testing, we are going to find more and more people, and places like the RBC and the other universities are really starting to think about how they can help. Now, that might be giving you a computer for your exams. It might be printing your exam on different color paper. It might be giving you some funny glasses with yellow lenses in them. And that is all things that we need to think about as a profession, and think about how we can support our dyslexic vets coming through. Now, another thing I'm hugely passionate about, just stepping away from dyslexia slightly, but with a link, is mental health. And I know James is all about mental health as well. And I just wanted to touch on, and I'm not going to dwell, but I just wanted to touch on here, the links between neurodiversity and mental health issues or mental health concerns. If you are neurodiverse, you are suspected to be more at risk of developing depression or having other mental health concerns in your life. And I think as a profession, with the mental health crisis that we have at the moment, and I use the word crisis very, very readily, and I openly talk about it as a crisis because it is, I think understanding different neurodiversities and understanding dyslexia and how we can support vets in practice is absolutely key and really, really necessary. So hopefully we can touch on a few of those things today in this webinar. James, what have we got in the chat coming in?
Rory, thank you for that very open and honest sort of introduction to where we're coming from with this. And I think I would like to just pick up, if I can, on the point you were just making there about mental well-being as a whole and how neurodiversity fits into that, and what predisposing factors, concerns may come into that as well. There's a question that's come in here that I think gets to the nub of that now for practicing vets. And it's coming anonymously, so I'm not going to say where it's from, obviously, but somebody who's working as a vet saying, can we advise? Because they're really struggling with time management, they overrun on consults, staff get frustrated with them, they feel they've been bullied in a previous job, and now they're in this new job, unsure whether to tell colleagues that they're dyslexic. They just find this exhausting, and so wondering what reasonable adjustments in practice might help. And I think, you know, let's come to answer the question that you've asked specifically, but as a kind of intro to that, I would just like to reflect back to when I used to do a bit of small animal work quite a while ago now. It was a great relief for all the small animals of Ashbourne when I stopped doing it. But it was just a well-known fact, really, that our receptionist, Dolly had been a part of the practice since the day dot, really. She'd worked there since she left school 40 years ago. Dolly would come up to my consulting room between a good number of the consultations and say, James, what about the ear cleaner? What about the tablets? And I would say to her, really, who for? God, you know, that ability for that working memory to retain the knowledge that it needed whilst communicating well with the client, telling them what you're expecting of them and putting things in place for their animal was a real kind of blind spot for me. And so, yeah, between Dolly and I, we were able to work out a really good system of her making sure that the clients had exactly what they were expecting to have, reporting back to me if they didn't, and me trying to sort of take those few seconds after the consultation to, you know, to prioritize making sure that I was doing the things that the clients needed. But that worked because of the relationship that I had with Dolly. And you know, Rory, as we approach answering this question, I wonder if you would have any reflections on that as well.
Yeah, so I think my first point on that would be, it depends on what kind of dyslexic you are and what you struggle with and where you feel you excel and where your slight shortcomings are. Personally, mine's all about writing notes. That was the thing that uni did not prepare me for. I wasn't prepared for having to, in my allotted consult time, have to allow for 3, 4, 5 minutes of that to be at the computer writing. And the other thing I really struggle with is fatigue. And I think that will be something I hope that a lot of you watching, if you are dyslexic, will relate to, because we know that because dyslexia is technically a blindness, ocular stress rates in dyslexics are much quicker and much higher. So by 2, 3 o'clock, your eyes well, my eyes, when I'm reading from a screen particularly, I'm double reading words, they're blurry, they're moving around the screen, and I struggle with that particularly. So what I do is in the morning, I actually have a Word document on the screen that has a basis of a clinical note. So it has only concerns, ... and then I've got bright, alert, responsive, eyes, ears, nose, mouth, thoracic auscultation, abdominal palpation, and I can just go through that. I can copy and paste it, and I copy and paste it into my clinical notes, and then I go back and I edit what I need to edit in. And that, I have found, has really sped up my note writing, and actually has been the difference between me running 2 or 3 minutes behind each consult or actually sticking to time, which obviously is key, and particularly if anyone of you are as busy as I am at the moment, is absolutely key right now. Should we go back to the question? I have, in classic...
No, I think the next bit of this question for us to pick up, Rory, you're absolutely right. I think is this question around feeling potentially sort of bullied or got at work, and now whether this should be discussed with an employer. And if I may kick off on that, I would suggest that the sort of first point on that is, you're not under any legal obligation here. Either way would be my first sort of point. So do what feels right. And do what works for you and what works for your employer. I personally have always found it very helpful for the people close around me to understand various things about me. Yes, dyslexia, but also that that I quite enjoy being outdoors from time to time. So I'd like the opportunity, if I am having a day inside, that I'd like the opportunity to get outside at lunchtime. That it's quite likely that if one of my kids ring, I'm going to prioritise that over a discussion with them about the next dose of medication for whatever, not with a client, but potentially when we're in the kind of back room. Those kind of understandings about who you are, where you're coming from, what your priorities are, I find just helpful to share quite broadly. And of course, part of that is about dyslexia and what the implications of that are on my day-to-day working patterns. And I think Rory's made some really interesting comments about times of day. And one of the things that I've always reflected on with dyslexia, and I don't know if other dyslexics on the call have similar experiences, is that I definitely have dyslexic days. Days where just there is no point in me trying to proofread this document today. I'm going to put that to one side and do it a different day, because and for me, I'm perhaps oversharing here, I hope not, but there have been times for me where that is as challenging as going shopping is really hard. You walk into the supermarket and there's a row of tins, and I work off the pictures, to be quite honest, to know whether I'm buying tomatoes or beans, because just the processing of the words is just too much. Not every day, not many days, but on occasion I'll find that. So helping people around me to understand that, I think, is really important. I have to say, I come from a position where I was really lucky. I have very supportive employers, and then hopefully I was a supportive employer, I hope, afterwards. But the point by that stage, it was for me to kind of decide who and what I was telling stuff. I was the boss. I think if you are in a workplace where that's more challenging, then there's perhaps bigger questions to ask. And it would be unusual, wouldn't it, if I didn't mention BVA at some point during this session. And I think perhaps one of the avenues into being able to explore this would be through the kind of good workplace guidance and thinking what makes a good workplace. And part of that is meeting everybody's needs, and also not just meeting their needs, celebrating the things that they're brilliant at. Because by discussing your dyslexia and what what impact that has on you, you'll almost certainly divulge something that they'll go, wow, that's the way you think about that, is it? I want to use that. My partners used to love it in partners meetings. Didn't give me the facts and figures to read very often, but they would always come to me first when it was, what do you think about this? How should we approach this problem? Rory, any other comments?
Yeah, I'm nodding along there, and that is absolutely, it's how I hope that the profession will use neurodiversity. Neurodiversity should be celebrated. Having everyone the same would bring no new ideas and no sort of interesting sort of changes to practice, and no change across the board. So neurodiversity should absolutely be identified, celebrated, and utilized. So yeah, what you're saying there, James, about using those different things, I think going back to the original question, I personally, if it was me, yes, you have to be brave about it, but I would absolutely hold my hands up and say, yeah, I'm dyslexic. These are the things that I have identified I not struggle with, slightly slower with, and slightly different with. And these are the things that are really my strengths. And this is what I think you should be using me for. I am all about visual learning. Making this personal, I'm very, very much about visual. I don't do words, I do diagrams. Last week, I said to my boss, I need to be able to draw things for my clients. He immediately, I've got the greatest bosses in the world, and I shouldn't brag about that, but they are the greatest bosses. And I'm sure, I don't work for James, but I'm sure if I worked for James, he would do the same. He bought me a whiteboard. He literally went on Amazon, bought me a whiteboard and a couple of pens. And now for every single consult, I have my whiteboard and my pens. And it could be as little as drawing the ear canal. Or it could be as little as drawing the structure of an eye. It can be a cruciate surgery. It can be anything. And for me, that really helps with me explaining to people, because that's the other thing here is communication skills and communicating with clients, communicating with your colleagues as this question sort of encompasses. And I think if you can work out how best you communicate, whether it's with a receptionist, whether it's with your nurses, whether it's with a client, that is absolutely key as well.
Absolutely.
I think my internet might be
well, we're
slightly.
picking up on those points. I think there's a couple of things coming in on the comments here that I find really interesting, really feed into what we're talking about here now. One of them from Andrew, thank you, saying that in his early years in practice learned how to touch type, and that his sons went through the Dyslexia Institute and also learned to touch type while still in junior school. And Andrew, that's one I absolutely resonate with. I think this might be a difference, Rory, between how you and I experience this, and it sounds like perhaps Andrew is more similar to me. For me, starting to use a computer when I was towards the end of school and into university was an absolute revelation, because I found that if I was typing, I could think about what I was typing, whereas if I was writing, I would think about how to form the letters and form the structures of the words. It must use a subtly different part of the brain to action. I don't pretend to understand that, but there must be a difference there. But absolutely pick up on that, Andrew. And perhaps another one which has come in privately, has just disappeared now, about, please bear with me just 1 second. Sorry, this was a question which related to this, but was taking this a little bit further, about auditory dyslexia. Now, Rory, I'm going to be really honest, this is something where my knowledge is very scant, but I just wondered whether you had any comments from a BDA perspective about auditory processing disorder and how that might be related, might be different, whether that would be something you would wish to comment on.
Absolutely. I mean, I know only what I have read about auditory dyslexia. I am not auditory dyslexic myself. Now, I think this goes back to the fact that dyslexia for each person is different, and I think it comes under the same umbrella as dyslexia. I'm just looking back because I saw this message as well, and I'm just going to. Yeah. So
that's helpful.
Yes, Alistair. Yeah. So I think with that sort of thing, often there is it's an ear to mouth or ear to paper processing difference. So what you may struggle with is actually communicating with a client or communicating with colleagues. And it's interesting there, James was talking about forgetting to dispense the ear cleaner or dispense the wormers. And actually that could be an extension of a slightly auditory dyslexia here as well, because you've talked about it, you have heard that client say, yes, we need that, and you've processed that, but then it's gone and it's immediately left. So it's those sorts of things. And that's where I think we've got.
I think Rory has frozen on us here. I did just see a hand up a moment ago from Jim's iPad. Jim, did you want to come in? No? Okay, if you do want to come in, pop your hand up again or stick something in the chat box. That'd be absolutely great to hear. Hey, Jimmy, you're back. Do you want to come in? Do you want to unmute yourself and make a comment?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi there. I just wanted to ask if you found working with large animals and farmers easier than working with small animal clients, but were they more forgiving or less forgiving?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think for me the answer, but again it would be a very personal answer, would be about the differences in the way that we work. And I think the time pressure, we've talked a number of times in different around the edges ways over the last half hour about time pressures and about how that impacts on what we do and how we perform. And for me, perhaps that was one of the joys of working with farm animals, was that occasionally, but very, very rarely, was it a 10 or 15-minute consultation. Much more commonly, I was going to be with a client for an hour, a couple of hours, 3 hours. And that gave us the opportunity to work through a lot of those challenges ourselves and to reinforce stuff for each other. So yeah, I would say I'm not sure whether there was any more forgiveness or not, but perhaps better opportunity to make sure that we arrived at the end of the session knowing what we needed to do next. We perhaps both had the opportunity to scribble some notes or to take a couple of photographs of the calf shed. That was a thing that I got very into doing as a bit of a reminder. That's what we were talking about on the farm this morning, and we were able to sort of take that through in that way. So Jimmy, it sounded like that was a question that was coming from experience. Is there anything that you would want to add to what you've just asked?
Well, not really. I don't think I'm dyslexic, and but I don't write very well, so I could be. And I do have a grandson who is dyslexic, so that's why I was interested in that. And I think I met you, I'm not sure, a long, long time ago, and we went on a small boat over to a small island called Alba.
I thought I recognised the voice, Mr. Wilson. Good afternoon. Yeah. So that's really interesting to hear about your grandson. And I think if we want to pick up and have a chat about your grandson at another time, then let's please do. But yeah, I think we can probably both reflect now, knowing where you're coming from, about that time that you have to spend with those farm clients and the way that you can carry out that relationship, which perhaps is more favourable to those who are being challenged. So yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca. Oh, you came off mute momentarily and then went back on, Rebecca. Hiya.
Hiya, sorry, I've been trying to write in the chat for ages, but this one won't let me. I was going to say, I think, concentrating on the positives of dyslexia are really interesting. Like, there's studies to show that we're really great, like, lateral thinkers and problem solvers. So although it might take us longer to write up notes or things like that, our problem solving ability is like incredible, and we're really quick at that. So that's like a really good positive that people could bring up in interviews or with management or etc. And I just wondered how comfortable people felt with disclosing that they were dyslexic to clients, and how that affects their kind of relationship with clients, and whether anybody had kind of any kind of takeaway things, whether they saw that as a positive.
That's a really interesting question, Rebecca. And if people wanted to either put comments in the chat or put their hand up on how they deal with this with clients, that's an area we haven't explored yet. So thank you for that. While I've got you on the screen, though, in terms of what you just alluded to there with, we're talking to potential employers about this, as well as existing employers, and talking about how we're going to, what we can bring to the party, if you like. Do you mind me asking, how have you handled that through interviews or through the application process or whatever? Because I know it's something which comes up quite commonly with a whole range of different, be they neurodiversities or social norms or whatever, is at what stage do we talk about this when we're coming to a new employer? So what was your experience, Rebecca, of that?
Oh my goodness. So I was only diagnosed as being dyslexic 2 years ago when I was studying my master's at King's. I'd always thought that I was, but didn't think that I needed help because I'd always done quite well in exams and passed. And then my master's was really essay-based writing. So I kind of thought, right, I need some support here now. So I actually haven't applied for a job in the time that I've been diagnosed. But thinking about it now, I think if I was to apply for a new job, I would definitely put it on my CV as a talking point for the interview. And with the kind of opinion that, like, if I didn't get an interview or somebody wasn't inquisitive, an employer wasn't inquisitive or willing to talk about it or, you know, see it as a positive, then I probably wouldn't want to work for them. You know, that's kind of how you have to go into every interview, really, isn't it? It's a two-way thing. So yeah, I think I would be really kind of open about it and really play on the positives rather than the negatives. Not that I think that there's any negatives of dyslexia, like Rory said, we're just all different. That's, you know, that's the way it is. But I think, yeah, there's loads that we can bring, and talking about it within the team. And I have since spoken to clients when I've kind of fumbled my words or not been able to start using the big word for a disease and then not finished it. And they kind of look at you like, oh, there's kind of lacking confidence. And I just, oh, I'm really sorry, I'm dyslexic. And the amount of clients that have come back and said, oh, so am I, or somebody else that I know is, and immediately you become a person, like a kind of person that they can relate to. And yeah, I've had some like really lovely moments with clients.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rebecca. Rebecca, please don't disappear if you're happy to. There's a question that's come in specifically for you on the text here.
Oh God, okay.
Which is great. So I'm going to put you on the spot with that in just a moment. But I think what I just wanted to explore a little bit was this bit about discussing this with potential employers. And one of the things that I've done right through lockdown and have thoroughly loved doing has been working with students in what we call carpool cases. And we've explored all sorts of different issues in carpool cases, including CV writing and what should we be putting in a CV, what should we be putting to a potential employer. And one of the questions that came up when we ran that session a few weeks ago was somebody who came on and they said, I'm a practicing Muslim. Should I put that into my application document, because I'll need to have, wherever I go to work, I'll need to have the space, the time to be able to carry out prayers at the appropriate moments during the day. And you know, why is he talking about being a Muslim when we're on a dyslexia webinar? But I think there's some similarities here, aren't there, about what you've just said there, of if you put in this stuff about yourself, stuff which is important to you and about you, into an application form, and people are then filing it in the big round one, well, did you want to work there? Was that the right place for us to work? And I think there's perhaps something of a parallel there, isn't there?
Yeah. Does anybody want to work there?
Right, yeah. There's lots of questions coming in about how we're going to manage this, and that's the section I would like to come on to. But the question I said I would put to you, Rebecca, is refers to the person bouncing on your lap now. Hello, absolutely fantastic to have you here. But the question is, if you're tired, and therefore particularly I think thinking about babies, whether that affects your dyslexia.
Yes, definitely. I completely related to your supermarket story. Yeah, definitely. I think yeah, but again, it's really difficult, isn't it? Because I've never lived as a non-dyslexic person, so like this is just how we, like you say, like how we live. But definitely, like I think the phonics, the way that I form words or get things confused, and my speech will definitely be affected if I'm tired. Yeah. And it's kind of frustrating because it's that kind of feeling where, and I think especially at school or in an education kind of setting, if I feel nervous as well, that also can kind of affect it. So in an education setting, or sometimes if you had a young dyslexic vet who was doing their first few consults with clients, like sometimes that I remember kind of getting my words a bit fumbled then. I think, you know, that's kind of can affect your mental health, because you feel a little bit stupid, like I can't get this sentence together and I feel a bit silly. So I think for an employer or for a colleague, you know, for those kind of younger vets, just being, you know, having that kind of support there for those first few consults, definitely, because they're going to be tired because they're in their new job and, you know, everything that goes along with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Rebecca, thank you for having the confidence to come on the screen today and to share.
Sorry, I thought I should give some context, not being able to put my words together.
Why we're here today. So thank you for that. I saw Rory reappear and now disappear again. I suspect that the South London Wi-Fi is letting him down there. But I said I would try and move on to some of the more kind of practical comments on this. And so while Rory gets himself back into the room, that's what I think we will do, because I had a question here about, so I'm an RVN and a clinical coach. My new student is dyslexic. I'm really interested to see what sort of things I can do to help her through her qualification. And Melissa, thank you for your comment to Rebecca there. I would agree entirely with that. A very eloquent description of lived experience. And thank you, Rebecca, and I'm Harold as well for your comments as well there. So let's start to drill down into some of this. And first and foremost, it's about knowing where we can go for those resources, isn't it? So the British Dyslexia Association have all sorts of information on their website about how you can make things more accessible for a range of dyslexic, I was going to say phenotypes there, which isn't what I mean at all, is it? But hopefully you can appreciate what I mean, a whole load of dyslexic presentations. And but within that, I said I wanted to try and explore some of the things about, hiya Rory, welcome back. We're just in a process here. Don't worry at all, we're having a bit of a, I'm just starting to explore the question that came in from someone who said they're an RVN and a clinical coach, wanting to get some sort of specifics now about how they can help their dyslexic student through their qualifications. I've highlighted that the BDA webinar website is going to be an excellent port to go to, but what I was just wanting to start to explore was some of those general things that I said we could do which would help make things better for everybody. Yeah. So please do come in whenever you wish to, but I would be looking at things like when we do write a document, let's have a think. Let's start with the font that we're using. Okay, there are some brilliant fonts out there. I now use Creative Dyslexic on my home computer. It's a free to download font. I really like it, especially if I'm feeling tired. I will just copy and paste any document I've been sent to look at and just change it into that font. Makes a huge difference. If you haven't got the capacity to do that, at least make sure we're using sans serif fonts. Now, serifs are all those curly squirrely bits that you get on, you know, things like Times New Roman, those sorts of fonts. All the curly swirly bits, they're really not helpful for somebody to try and read, or for a lot of dyslexics to try and read. So the sans serif fonts take away a lot of those curly swirlies, but also there will be differences between a B and a D, other than the fact that one is the mirror of the other. They'll be constructed slightly differently, which is really helpful for people to try and interpret what that squiggle on a page actually means. So we can think about the font. We can then think about the layout. And our brains naturally look for shapes of words and shapes of sentences as well, to an extent. So therefore, as soon as we say we're going to justify this text, you know, make it so that every line goes to the edge of the page, the way the computer does that is to space out and to squash up and to, you know, to bodge about really with those letters. Let's keep it left aligned so that actually every word, every time we write a word, it looks exactly the same as last time we wrote it. Every time we see a letter spacing, it's exactly the same as last time we saw it. Then let's think about making sure that that's big enough to read comfortably. So I would suggest a minimum font size of 12 for anything that you're asking for somebody to write, with decent paragraph breaks as well in between it, so that we can see there is a chunk of text and we can anticipate that that chunk of text is going to be different in its content to that chunk of text there. Okay. Now perhaps we've got the opportunity to think about the contrast between the text and the paper. And we alluded earlier to my daughter and her yellow glasses, and I think Rory, you were talking about different colour glasses, what have you. And that's a specific condition called Erland's syndrome, which Erland's syndrome and dyslexia are different, but very often commingle. They don't for me. It makes no difference at all for me, but they very often commingle. So, but what certainly helps everybody, again, say coming down to those basic things, let's just use cream paper rather than plain white. Okay, just takes away some of that glare, some of that absolute stark contrast between the text and the paper, and just makes it easier to read. Rory's talked about visual fatigue, ocular fatigue, a big issue for everybody, an even bigger issue if you're really struggling to process it as well. So again, something we can do which is going to help everybody. So those would be my kind of go-to tips in terms of presenting something. We'll come on to how we talk about stuff, how we reinforce stuff. But before I do, Rory, I just wanted to know if there's anything you would disagree with or you would add to in what I've just said.
Absolutely, I think they're all brilliant points, and there are also filters. So if you are someone who does suffer with ocular stress and finds that colours help, I wouldn't necessarily change the colour of your text. Some people like a reverse, so some people like a slightly yellow on a black background. That can work quite nicely, but equally just a shift to either a pinkier colour or a blue filter can really, really help. And actually you can get software to install on your computer that just changes the whole screen. It just makes it all pink or all blue, and that can really, really help. And having that as a practice manager, if there's any practice managers watching, install those things on your computers. It's going to take you an afternoon. Go and install a color filter, install a magnifying toolbar, which is really, really good. So particularly when you're looking at reports and things like that, where you can't change the text size on a PDF, having a magnifying toolbar that you can pull over it as a dyslexic can really, really help you read as well. And then thinking about also having things printed on exactly cream paper or slightly yellow paper. And someone mentioned in the chat about putting PowerPoints and things on a slightly off-white background. All things that are really, really going to help. And the other thing that I'm just going to add in there as well, James, is if you are someone who is a mentor or has a mentee that you're teaching, ask them whether they prefer to learn from a screen or from paper, because that can make a huge difference as well. For me, screens, I've got an hour and then my eyes go. If it's on paper, I'm a much, much happier person, and you'll keep my concentration for a lot longer. And I think just going back to originally the question here as well, ask them how you can help them. They will have lived with this for 18, 19, 20, 30, 40 years of their life. They will be aware of what works for them, what doesn't. And if they're not, you can explore those things together.
Absolutely. And there's some lovely comments coming in here. Ruth making the comment, how can I help you? You know, I think that's a really important one. I was really interested in this from Vicky, and we will come on to some of these other sort of learning things, but I think this leads us into it. Vicky coming from the opposite position, being the dyslexic person who has 7 students who are not dyslexic and being concerned about how to teach them, saying that she would jump to colours and diagrams, but don't know what a non-dyslexic would want. And I think, you know, my kind of first trite answer to that would be, you know, the words of Richard Gross, the author of psychology textbooks hated by A-level psychology students since the day dot. You know, when you've met one dyslexic, then you've met one dyslexic. And so just as there's a huge diversity of needs amongst dyslexics, so there are between the whole of the rest of society as well. So I think any of the questions we're asking here about what works for you, how should we approach this, are going to be brilliant. And the very fact that you're asking those questions already puts you in the place of being a very strong candidate to be a good mentor, a good teacher for those people. And you see it in school now, don't you? You know, we've got beyond the kind of auditory, visual, kinesthetic ideas of learning into much more complex versions of that. But you see good teachers putting in place multiple different sort of modalities of learning for kids in school. So again, Rory, a quick question on that before we come into reinforcing work.
Absolutely. I think that's the thing, isn't it? If we define neurodiversity, it's the understanding that everyone is diverse, and it doesn't matter whether you have a learning difference or a cognitive difference. Everyone is different. So just understand that and remember that. And just because visual and diagrams work for you does not mean that they don't work for other people. So of your 7 students, 6 of them might love that, but look out for those that aren't quite. Put yourself in those teachers' shoes. Let's go back to the 90s when there's kids in school and you're that disruptive one. Look out for that behavior, because it's repeated and it's repetitive, and look out for anyone that's not quite engaging, and ask yourself, okay, why is that? And ask them, why is that? And try and understand, okay, my diagrams don't work, but here's a chunk of text that I would hate, James would probably hate, you would probably hate, but that might work for them. So ask each student, remember each is slightly different, and change for them.
Absolutely. And I think this generational evolving nature of our understanding of this is coming through in some of the questions. And Melissa, thank you for what you've shared, that you do talk with your clients about being dyslexic, because it potentially helps them to understand you better. But recognizing that having the confidence of your veterinary degree gives you the confidence to feel that you've achieved enough to be able to say that. I absolutely understand that and recognize that. But equally, they're talking about your dad, a builder, who was delighted to hear that dyslexia was perhaps a thing, because he just thought he was thick. And yeah, we could bring my mum into this conversation here. She would have a lot to add to that as well, recognizing what it was like growing up in the 50s and 60s, and people's understanding of neurodiversity there. So thank you for that. I did promise we would come back to this point about reinforcing work and reinforcing answers and helping people to retain information. And I hope that in a way we've covered this in our discussion about all of us learning differently, but all of us having some similar needs. And so, in conversations with various dyslexic people, some will talk to me about being able to visualize stuff. So, for example, I remember working with a student while I was still in practice, and she said to me, "Oh yeah, the fridge door is hind limb anatomy. That's where hind limb anatomy is. So what I'm going to do now is sit here and think about the fridge door. The cupboard door where the cereals are, that's heart physiology, whatever it might have been." And that's how she did it. She segmented the learning and was able to sort of take it then as a full picture. Wouldn't work for me at all, I'll be quite honest. But I think it's about allowing those students to explore, what it's going to be that's going to reinforce their learning. Is it that you do, 10 questions on it when they first walk into the office in the morning, and you do that verbally? Is it that, they're going to produce a load of Post-it notes, or they're going to write a load of stuff down and repetitively write it? I never understood why my wife did that when she was revising for exams. But you've just written that over there, and now you're writing it again, and tomorrow you're going to write it again. But that's how she learned. That's what worked for her. So yeah, I don't really feel I've directly answered that question, partly because I don't feel there's a direct answer to it. But again, Rory, is there anything that you would say?
I think what we've got to do as a profession, for me, is we've got to be more aware of it, and it's already brilliant. I mean, the RCVS hosting this series of Mind Matters webinars is testament enough to the fact that we are becoming more aware of it. We are talking about it more openly. I think we've got to embrace it, because, as we said right at the start of this, 10% of us are dyslexic, if not more, or have another neurodiversity as well. So it is something that is in a large proportion of us. And I think making allowances, whether it be color papers, talking to your staff and talking to each other about what works for you and understanding each other, is only going to be beneficial in the long run. I think if you are someone with dyslexia, go and speak to your boss. I think that's something that that's a conversation that probably hasn't ever been had, or has been had in a handful of times. And I think if that conversation can be started to have in the norm, and bringing that into even the interview process, as we were talking about with CV writing, I think if we can be aware of it earlier on and make those allowances earlier on, then we're going to find actually practice life is much, much easier and much more reliable and better, because, as we said again, each person has their superpower. Each person has their thing that they're brilliant at. And I call dyslexia my superpower all the time, because there's certain things that I think are great and some things I'm rubbish at, but each person will have those differences. And if you can work together and understand each other on a working relationship basis, then it is going to be beneficial.
Fantastic. Rory, we're coming towards our last couple of minutes here, and I would like, having felt like I've spoken too much in this session, I would like to give the kind of closing comments to you about how we might move forward. But in order just to bring us to that, if I may, I'd encourage people to do two things before we finish. If you open your chat box, there are 3 little dots that say more. You can do that and you can save the chat. And the reason I'd encourage you to do that is because, not least, there's some lovely supportive comments in here, I think, for all of us to go away and reflect on from today. I've certainly learned a bit about myself. I'm going away to find out a bit more about this auditory processing syndrome. One of the things I find hardest is when I'm on the phone to, you know, British Gas or whatever, and they say, would you like me to give you the reference for that? Not really. Tell me, but I won't be able to write it down. So that's one thing. But also, Angharad has shared in there some links to how to make documents more accessible. Thank you for doing that, Angharad. I've shared in there the link to the colour veil technology that I use on my computer that Rory was referring to. But also, there's some questions in there about what we might do next and whether we're interested in trying to set up a little group of people here who can perhaps act as a bit of a support group, but potentially also therefore act as a bit of a amplifier of some of the messages that we've tried to talk about today. And Chloe, I don't know if you're there, but I wonder if you are, whether I could bring you in at this point, because one question here is about whether we're able to share email addresses and what have you. And I wonder whether as a starting point for that, whether if I were to set up a closed Facebook group or something, whether you, Chloe, would be able to share that with people who've registered for today's webinar. So are you able just to comment on that?
Hi, yes, I can certainly send out some links and things afterwards for useful information, and yeah, I can, if there is a Facebook group, we can make that available to people who've registered. Yeah. Fantastic.
I will commit to setting that up then. I'm not going to run it. I'm not going to kind of boss that, whatever. This will be something that will be a very collaborative thing, but I'll get that set up and I'll get the link to it to Chloe to share with everyone who registered for today. I think that could be a really positive outcome of this. I hope what we take from this is that neurodiversity is everywhere, all around us. What we can learn from those of us who experience different neurodiversities is hopefully positive for society as a whole, and that what we can give as dyslexics to our practices, to our workplaces, is hopefully far more beneficial than any of the challenges we might have because we forget to dispense the eardrops. On which note, as I say, Rory, I'd like to pass to you to be able to close this off.
Yeah, I think this has been brilliant to just talk openly about dyslexia in the profession, talk about neurodiversity in the profession. I think it is, as I said, testament to the changing times in the profession, the more open conversations we're having. And it's only going to be beneficial. I think if you are a dyslexic yourself, it's time to embrace it if you haven't already, time to be proud of it if you haven't already. If you have any other neurodiversity, equally the same applies. I think it's something that we need to talk about in practice, not just on webinars like this. Just because this is a dyslexia webinar, we're talking about dyslexia, go and have this conversation with your colleagues, go and have this conversation with your bosses and make a change, because if you can pioneer some change in your practice, it's only going to help students and new vets coming through the ranks. And you never know, that might help with their practice experience and their long-term veterinary career. So talk about it, make the changes for you, and discuss with your colleagues, because if you're struggling in silence, it might be that your colleagues are as well. So please talk to them, please talk to your bosses, and yeah, let's make this group and talk about dyslexia more openly.
Thank you, Rory. What a lovely positive way for us to finish, for us all to think, who are we going to go off and talk to about what we can add to their lives thanks to our dyslexia. What a lovely place to finish. Thank you for being here today, everyone. I hope there's been some useful take-homes. I've certainly loved spending the last hour with some like-minded people talking these sorts of issues through. So thank you ever so much for your attendance. Good afternoon to you all.